She wants depth, not attention, not intensity, not surface-level connection. Depth. And yet, the moment things begin to feel emotionally close, she pulls back. This contradiction confuses almost everyone, because from the outside, it looks irrational. How can someone crave intimacy and fear it at the same time? But psychologically, this is one of the most predictable patterns in attachment. And it doesn't come from indecision, it comes from experience. She craves depth because shallow connection feels empty to her. But she fears vulnerability because depth has hurt her before. So her mind splits. One part reaches forward, another part breaks, and that internal conflict shapes everything you see. Depth to her means being seen, not admired, not wanted, seen. It means exposing thoughts she usually protects, feelings she doesn't explain easily, needs she learned not to ask for. But vulnerability requires one thing above all else: emotional safety over time. And this is where fear enters, because her nervous system remembers moments when opening up didn't lead to closeness. It led to misunderstanding, dismissal, or emotional abandonment. So while her heart longs for depth, her body remembers the cost. And the body always speaks louder than desire. This is why her behavior feels inconsistent. She opens up, then withdraws. She shares, then goes quiet. She leans in, then creates distance. Not because she's playing games, but because two survival instincts are running simultaneously. The need for connection, the need for self-protection. And until one feels safer than the other, the push-pull continues. Most people misread this stage badly. They think, she doesn't know what she wants. She does. She wants depth without pain. But pain is exactly what her nervous system associates with vulnerability. So instead of trusting the connection fully, she regulates closeness. She allows intimacy in measured doses. She retreats before exposure feels overwhelming. She stays partially guarded even when feelings are real. This is also why reassurance alone never solves it. You can say, "You can trust me. I'm not like the others. I won't hurt you." But trust isn't built through statements. It's built through emotional consistency under pressure. Her system isn't asking, "Do you mean well?" It's asking, "Will this cost me later?" So she watches. She watches how you respond when she's vulnerable, how you hold space without fixing, how you react when emotions aren't neat or convenient. Because depth doesn't require perfection. It requires containment. And fear appears when containment is uncertain. Here's the part most people never understand. She doesn't fear intimacy. She fears exposure without protection. Depth to her is emotional meaning. Vulnerability is emotional risk. And the two are not the same. She can crave conversations that go beyond the surface. Ideas, emotions, shared inner worlds, while still fearing the moment where she has to place her emotional safety in someone else's hands. Because vulnerability means, if this goes wrong, I don't get to pretend it didn't matter. And her nervous system remembers what that cost her before. This is why she often opens up intellectually before she opens up emotionally. She may talk deeply about life, trauma, values, psychology, fears in general, but she hesitates when it comes to her expectations of you, her emotional needs from you, her attachment to this connection, because general vulnerability feels safer than personal vulnerability. General vulnerability doesn't create dependency. Personal vulnerability does. So she tests depth before allowing exposure. She wants to see, can this person handle complexity without judgment? Can they sit with emotion without rushing to fix it? Can they stay present without becoming overwhelmed? Because if you can't hold depth calmly, you won't be able to hold vulnerability safely. This is also why rushing closeness backfires here. When someone pushes for, "Why won't you just open up? You can tell me anything. Why are you holding back?" Her system hears pressure, and pressure feels like danger. So even though she wants depth, the moment vulnerability is demanded, her body pulls away, not because she doesn't trust you, but because she doesn't yet trust the outcome. Another important layer, vulnerability requires emotional regulation, not emotional intensity. People often confuse intensity with closeness. They think deep emotion equals deep connection. But for her, intensity feels unpredictable. And unpredictability is what her nervous system avoids. So when closeness becomes emotionally loud, fast, or consuming, fear replaces desire. She doesn't retreat from love. She retreats from losing herself. This is why her pattern often looks like this. She leans in emotionally, feels the bond strengthening, then pulls back just enough to breathe, not to punish, not to test, but to regain internal balance. Depth excites her. Vulnerability destabilizes her, until safety is proven. This is also why she values emotional restraint more than grand gestures. She watches how you stay grounded when she's unsure, remain steady without demanding reassurance, respect distance without withdrawing affection, because these behaviors tell her, this connection won't consume me, and once that belief forms, fear begins to loosen. Here's a hard truth most people don't see. Many people increase fear while trying to be emotionally supportive, not because they mean harm, but because they confuse closeness with intensity. And intensity is exactly what her nervous system cannot relax into. When someone responds to her vulnerability with urgency, excessive reassurance, emotional overinvestment, constant checking, or dramatic validation, it doesn't feel like safety. It feels like responsibility. Shares more when regulation remains intact. Depth remains constant. Fear slowly fades, not because she forced herself to trust, but because her nervous system stopped bracing. Here's the shift that almost no one notices when it happens. Vulnerability doesn't arrive through conversation. It arrives through felt safety, not the kind of safety you promise, the kind her body experiences, because trust is not a decision. It's a physiological response. She doesn't suddenly wake up and decide to open up. Her nervous system does something quieter. It stops scanning for danger. That's it. And when scanning stops, vulnerability appears naturally, without effort, without announcement. This is why people who constantly ask, "Do you trust me yet?" or "Why won't you open up?" never get what they're asking for, because the very need to ask signals instability. Her system hears, "My calm depends on your openness," and dependence reactivates fear. What actually changes things is emotional containment over time. Containment means you don't rush emotional moments. You don't escalate closeness artificially. You don't pull away when space appears. You remain consistent whether she leans in or leans back. That consistency does something powerful. It teaches her nervous system this connection doesn't collapse under fluctuation. And once fluctuation is safe, vulnerability becomes possible. Another layer many people misunderstand. When vulnerability finally appears, it often looks ordinary. Not dramatic confessions, not emotional breakdowns, not intense declarations. It looks like sharing small insecurities, expressing needs calmly, revealing fears without tension. Because real vulnerability is relaxed, not emotional. And relaxed vulnerability only exists in safe environments. This is why some people say, "She opened up out of nowhere." It wasn't out of nowhere. It was after weeks, sometimes months, of emotional steadiness. No pressure, no demand, no emotional spikes, just presence. Here's something subtle but important. Once vulnerability feels safe, depth deepens. Because now, depth no longer threatens her sense of self. It becomes nourishing instead of draining. And that's when the connection shifts from guarded to grounded. Not because she overcame fear, but because fear was no longer needed. This is also why trust disappears instantly when safety breaks. One moment of emotional volatility can undo weeks of calm. Not because she's fragile, but because the nervous system prioritizes survival over connection. And survival doesn't negotiate. Here's the resolution most people never witness because it happens quietly. Depth and vulnerability don't clash by nature. They clash only when safety is incomplete. Once safety becomes consistent, the conflict dissolves on its own. Not through effort, not through persuasion, not through emotional intensity, through predictable calm. At this stage, her nervous system reaches a conclusion. I don't have to protect myself here. And when protection is no longer needed, fear steps aside. This is the moment depth stops being guarded and vulnerability stops being threatening. Not because she suddenly trusts more, but because nothing in the environment is asking her to brace. This is why emotionally mature connections feel different. There's no rush, no pressure, no emotional performance. Just a steady rhythm where closeness doesn't demand sacrifice. And in that rhythm, vulnerability feels natural. Notice what doesn't happen here. There's no announcement, no dramatic shift, no conversation about opening up. She simply starts sharing more of herself, casually, calmly, without fear of consequence. Because fear has no job left to do. This is the paradox that defines her psychology. She never feared vulnerability itself. She feared vulnerability without containment. Once containment is felt, depth and vulnerability become allies. Depth gives meaning. Vulnerability gives intimacy. And both exist without threatening her autonomy. This is also why forcing vulnerability always fails. You can't negotiate safety. You can't argue fear away. You can't rush nervous system trust, but you can be the environment where fear doesn't need to exist. And when that happens, everything shifts without effort. What she's responding to at this point isn't what you say or do. She's responding to what doesn't change. Your emotional steadiness, your respect for pace, your ability to stay grounded without control. That steadiness tells her something profound. This connection won't cost me myself. And once that belief is internalized, vulnerability is no longer a risk. It becomes a choice. She never wanted surface connection. She wanted to be understood without being overwhelmed, to be close without losing herself. What looked like fear was never fear of intimacy. It was fear of intimacy without safety. She learned that depth can feel beautiful, but vulnerability in the wrong environment can feel expensive. So she moved carefully, measured closeness, protected her inner world, not because she lacked courage, but because she learned the cost of opening too fast. When safety became consistent, the conflict dissolved. Depth no longer threatened her. Vulnerability no longer required armor. And when fear no longer had a job, she didn't have to choose between closeness and self-protection. She chose both. If this helped you understand her mind a little better, subscribe not for content, but for clarity.